Hi everybody, this is Mrs. D'Amico, one of the librarians here at Phoenix, and today we're going to look at fantasy books and find out something about them. Our lesson objectives here are: you will be able to list some characteristics of fantasy books, and you will be able to identify fantasy books when you see them, and that will happen at the end of our lesson. You can see we have a monster theme going here on all these slides. Well, monsters are not real, so they are probably fantasy. Fantasy books tell stories that are not true and could never be true. They might include imaginary worlds, fantastic creatures, or ordinary people or animals that can do extraordinary things. There are many different types of fantasy books. And here are some things that you might see in fantasy books: magic, other worlds, make believe. The list goes on and on. And on the next few slides, I'm going to show you some different examples of books we have here in the library. Fantasy books could be about magic, like this one, Upside Down Magic. We have this series in the library, lots of books for you to read and enjoy. Other worlds could be a theme of fantasy books. We know Star Wars happens in other worlds. There might be make-believe creatures like dragons or trolls or witches or mermaids. How to Train Your Dragon is an excellent example of a fantasy book. There are lots of books about time travel, and here is one called Epic Kids. You can see they're going through this door, and they're going to be traveling through time. Supernatural books about ghosts or werewolves or vampires or things of a supernatural nature are considered fantasy books. And superhero books are also fantasy books. Now I'm going to read to you from two different stories here that we have in the library, and both of them are fantasy stories. So here is part of the first one. It's the Spirit Animals series, and this story is Against the Tide by Tui T. Sutherland. Chapter 1 says, "The people of Stetriol called it Muttering Rock. They knew vaguely where it was, deep in the scorched, arid interior of the continent. They knew of the muttering sound that made the earth tremble for miles in all directions around it. And they knew the name of the dark, sinister creature imprisoned there. Most of all, they knew never to go anywhere near it if they wanted to survive. So no one had visited Kovo the ape's prison in hundreds of years. Not that it would be easy, if anyone had even wanted to try. Muttering Rock was far out in the Stetriol desert, many days from the nearest source of water. Each side of the rock was a sheer cliff face with no handholds, as if someone had sliced away the edges with one swipe of a powerful blade. The top of the rock was baked by the sun to a blistering 200 degrees or so. No one had ever measured the exact temperature, of course, but it was enough to instantly and badly burn any foot or boot or paw that tried to step onto it. The cage itself seemed to be growing out of the top of the rock, a vast network of impenetrable branches as hard as diamonds. It glowed a pure, blinding white, particularly at its sharpest points, where it still had the vague shape of the giant antlers planted centuries ago by the great beast Telhun. And of course there was the eagle overhead, Hallowir, the sharp-eyed guard who watched Kovo every day and all night too. So no visitors. Not in a very, very long time. Hence the muttering. "First I will peel off their skin," growled a voice like thunder in the distant mountains. "I will crush their skulls between my fists. I will wrap their bones in their green cloaks and set fire to their homes. Their fortresses will be dust beneath my feet." The malevolent eyes of an enormous silverback gorilla glowered through the gaps in the cage. His thick black fur was heavy in the heat. There was no room in his cage for pacing, so he sat, brooding and waiting as he had for generations. Kings and empires had risen and fallen since his imprisonment, but still he waited, and while he waited, he dreamed of vengeance. Now, that's just the first 2 pages of this story. You can tell it's fantasy because there is an animal that can talk, and it's been alive for hundreds of years. And it sounds like some people are going to be in trouble soon. All right, so that was one example. Here's a book called The Story Thieves, The Stolen Chapters. This is another book that has many books to this series. It was written by James Riley. And this is a little bit different. No big animals in it. All right, so here we have part of one chapter. Someone was trying to steal Owen's life, and there was nothing Owen could do about it. "Your life is mine now," said the story thief, a brown-haired boy wearing the exact same t-shirt, the exact same jeans, and the exact same face as Owen. "No!" Owen tried to shout, but he couldn't move or talk. His body wouldn't respond. The duplicate leaned in, hands reaching out for Owen, and that's when Owen woke up with a start. Wait, he'd been asleep? It was just a dream? A scary, sweaty, awful dream. Owen wanted to laugh. It was all a dream. That was the worst possible ending to any story, but right now it definitely felt comforting. It had felt much too real, though he supposed that that was dreams for you. Owen ran his hands over his sheets, happy to still be in bed. Except his sheets felt a lot like carpet, and he wasn't lying on a pillow. Also, his carpet-feeling sheets were orange for some reason. "Huh?" Owen said. He picked up his head a bit from the carpet, only to wince and drop his head back down to the floor, squeezing his eyes shut. A huge ache pounded through his temples, and everything smelled weirdly smoky. He tried opening his eyes again, but even the little bit of light in the room caused his head to ache and scream at him. But Owen knew that orange carpet. He knew it like the back of his hand, which admittedly he didn't know all that well, but still. This was the library. He was face down on the floor of his mother's library, and he had no idea how he had gotten there. Gathering all of his courage, Owen opened his eyes again to look. "Owen?" said a voice to his side, followed by a painful groan. "Keel?" Owen said, and groaned too as he turned slightly to face the direction the voice had come from. Keel Nomenfoot, former boy magician and hero to millions as star of his own book series, looked like he wanted to burst into tears. "Owen," Keel repeated, as if the word tasted bad. "Why, head hurt." Owen tried to bring up a word or two, something along the lines of, "I have no idea, but it's obviously for evil reasons," but all he managed to croak out was, Figuring that wasn't enough, he slapped his hand a few times on the floor, then cringed at the noise. How had he and Keel gotten into his mom's library? The last thing Owen remembered was... Wait, what was the last thing he remembered? It was like everything in the recent past was just gone. He remembered Keel being introduced to their class as Kyle, a new student, but that was the last thing. How long ago had that been, and why couldn't he remember anything else? Thunder crashed, and Owen grabbed his head as it erupted in pain, which made him face plant onto the floor. After a moment of pure agony, something more urgent than the ache seeped through his brain. "Do you smell smoke?" he asked Keel. Owen pushed himself up and over onto his back so at least he wouldn't hit his head again if he fell. "Probably," Keel moaned from his side. "Is something on fire?" Dark black smoke began to curl into sight above Owen on the library's ceiling, and in spite of the pain, Owen immediately sat up. "Keel," he shouted, "the library's on fire." "No yelling," Keel shouted back, and they both groaned. Keel slowly pushed himself up too and looked around. "Oh, fire, that's not a good thing. Hold on, I'll use whatever it is I do, magic, to put it out." "Holding," Owen said, gritting his teeth and waiting. "Hurry, hurry!" A pause, and then Keel gasped. "They're not there." "What aren't?" "My wand knives," he said, and then paused. "Owen, I can't remember any magic, and my spell book's gone too. I can't do magic without it or my wands." "A brilliant observation," said a too deep, fake-sounding voice behind them, as if someone was walking into a voice changer. Which begs the question, what exactly can you do, Mr. Nomenfoot? What use are you without your magic? Owen turned to find himself staring at a short figure wearing a brown overcoat, a Sherlock Holmes hat, and a white mask with a black question mark where his face should have been. Well, that wasn't good. Gentlemen, the masked figure said, crossing his arms over his chest, I would say the game is afoot, but unfortunately, your game is already over. Well, there are certainly magical qualities here. First of all, he has wands and he can do magic if he knew where they were. And then there's a crazy man with a question mark where his face should be. Definitely fantastic stories. All right, before we end, you're going to test yourself. Which of these statements could be true of fantasy books? This first one here says fantasy books are true stories. Fantasy books can have make-believe characters. And the setting of a fantasy book can only be on Earth. Think about that. Which of these are true and which are not? And here are your answers. Fantasy books are not true stories. They will never be true. They can have make-believe characters. They can be on Earth or they can be anywhere else. Imagine whatever you want, and that's what your fantasy could be. Here are a few more. Time travel can happen in a fantasy book. People in a fantasy book might be able to do magic, or objects might have magical qualities. Animals or objects might be able to talk in fantasy books. Let's find out. It looks like all of these are true. Fantasy books are about imagine things that can never really happen. Let's take a look at these 6 books here. Out of 6 of these, which ones do you think might be fantasy books? Here we have The Secret Zoo, and it looks like there are a bunch of animals and a kid riding a polar bear. Kinda Like Brothers. Looks like a real place, doesn't it, with real kids there. Crenshaw. There's a little kid and there's this huge cat sitting on a bench. Here is Wings of Fire, and this looks like a dragon and people hiding from it. Hamstersaurus Rex. Oops, I need to stop moving this so you can see the whole book. Well, that looks like a monster hamster. Would that be real or not? And Mike Lupica has a book called The Bat Boy, and it looks like he's playing baseball. So out of those books, how many of them do you think are fantasy books? These 4 are fantasy books because this one contains